And we have some particularly strong representation from Philadelphia and the rest of Pennsylvania, which is the prime geographic focus for the Stonehenge Foundation. Right now, the Pennsylvania Juvenile Justice Task Force is working with leaders from the legislature, the governor's office, the courts, systems managers, providers, and young people and their advocates to use data and evidence to consider some significant reforms and innovations in the state's youth justice system. So this will be a real opportunity for folks from the state to hear from around the country on the issue of probation reform. I'm going to turn it over now for a few minutes to Ronnie Bloom, who's the Executive Director of the Stonehenge Foundation.
Thank you, Patrick. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ronnie Bloom, and I'm the Executive Director, as Patrick said, of the Stonehenge Foundation. We are thrilled to have so many participants registered for today's convening. And I think it's just really a testament to our panelists and also to Patrick, and also really to the timeliness of the issue that's going to be discussed today. I also want to thank our partners at Columbia University Justice Lab for co-hosting this event. For those of you who don't know us, Stonehenge is a Philadelphia-based foundation focused on improving the life outcomes of young people by advancing change in youth-serving systems, which includes youth justice, child welfare, health, and education. We award fellowships to exceptional leaders who work within and alongside these systems to catalyze change. We're incredibly proud that today's moderator, Patrick McCarthy, is a Stonehenge Visiting Fellow. Thank you, Patrick, for leading us in what I know is going to be a really thought-provoking discussion. The topic of today's event, the transformation of our juvenile probation system, is extremely timely, as we know, and it's one in which the foundation has invested deeply, both here in Philadelphia and across the state, working in close partnership with our system stakeholders. Our former and current fellows, Bob Schwartz, Dr. Naomi Goldstein, Dr. Leah Brogan, and Sangeeta Prasad are all leading innovative and collaborative efforts to make probation practices more effective, developmentally appropriate, community-based, and youth-centered. Today's esteemed panelists will be offering lessons and best practices to us from other jurisdictions across the US that have likewise embraced new and evidence-based models of youth probation. So with that, I just want to thank you all again so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it back over to Patrick.
Thank you, Ronnie. I think most folks on this call realize that juvenile probation really had its beginnings almost at the exact same time that the juvenile court was launched at the turn of the 20th century. And it's, in most jurisdictions, the most common form of disposition for young people who come before the court. And the reality is the basic model is largely unchanged over the last 100 years. Even as we've seen big declines in youth crime and big declines in the numbers of young people who are incarcerated, and more support for community-based and in-home services as alternatives to institutions, probation services and the probation processes have remained essentially unchanged in many jurisdictions. And in fact, in lots of jurisdictions, the substantial proportion of young people who are locked up after having been on probation are not locked up because they committed a new crime, but rather because of a technical violation of one of the conditions of probation. So we're now seeing new models of probation emerge, and they are heavily influenced by what we've learned from the science about adolescent development and by decades really of research on effective services and supports. The new models share themes of being community-based, family-focused, and youth-centered, and they're getting better results. So today we'll be hearing from some leaders of the movement to reinvent probation, and they'll be sharing their experiences and their lessons, their sense of where we ought to go next so that probation fits with the needs of today's young people and their families. We're going to start with some brief remarks from each of the 5 panelists. I'll introduce each in turn. When it's their turn to speak, they'll summarize a few of the major issues and lessons they want to share. And then I'll direct some follow-up questions to the panel. Again, as Mark said at the beginning, please add your own questions that we can pose to the panelists as the panel goes on, and we'll try to get to many of them, as many of them as we can in the time that we have available. So we're going to start with Steve Bishop, who's the Senior Associate with the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group at the E. Casey Foundation and the former director of Pennsylvania's Center for Juvenile Justice Training and Research. So Steve, can you tell us about what you see as the major components or elements of the new models of probation, and how do these new models differ from traditional probation?
Sure, thank you, Patrick. And I think to kind of answer your question, I think it's important to also understand some of the challenges. It was about a little more than 2 years ago when the Casey Foundation released our report, Transforming Juvenile Probation. Really the most significant finding, because everything else kind of flowed from that, was that probation is dramatically outsized. And the impacts of having an outsized system are pretty clear. One, we have too many kids on probation who simply don't need it. And two, for the young people who would benefit from probation services, they typically don't get everything that they need. I believe that we're really missing an opportunity because of some limited focus within probation practice over the last 10, 15 years, heavily focused on recidivism, thinking about criminogenic needs, as opposed to a broader view of youth development and what that body of research tells us. And the hardest, and those impacts are falling hardest on youth of color. Actually, since we've seen this movement towards evidence-based practices over the past 15 years, we've actually seen an increase in disparities over that same time period. Let me start with the diversion piece and really understand why we need to shrink probation caseloads. And this is also really critical when we talk about addressing disparities, because diversion is really where we see systemic racism rear its head in juvenile justice, because it's the intersection of so many different systems: education, mental health, child welfare, the courts, policing. And so we really see this intersection of systems that have typically not done well with Black and brown communities and other underserved communities, and have actually been a barrier in those communities. So to put this in perspective with the need for increased diversion, throw out a little bit of data. So we know that, as you said, probation is the most common disposition, but it's also helpful for people to understand that there are almost as many non-adjudicated youth on probation caseloads in this country as there are adjudicated youth. 121,000 non-adjudicated youth versus 139,000 adjudicated youth. We know that only about 6% of all delinquency offenses are for violent offenses, but we've seen diversion hover around 43, 44%. So what this adds up to is really a huge waste of system resources on low-level offenses, low-level kids who we know would otherwise age out of these behaviors on their own. And we see striking disparities at the point of diversion as well. I offer 3 policy recommendations, and I'm sure that my colleagues will be able to give specific examples from their jurisdictions how this really looks. 3 policy considerations for diversion. 1, having clear, consistent, and equitable diversion eligibility criteria. So by default, taking misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies off the table and diverting those completely. The second would be community-led diversion. What we know is that there are a whole host of really well-positioned, passionate community-based organizations out there, I believe, are best positioned to be the front line for most youth behaviors and be able to provide the services and supports that youth and families need. And the third would be what we call no-failed diversion. So in essence, it's counterproductive to pull kids into the formal system, those same kids who we deem not in need of probation, pull them into the system because they fail to meet some diversion obligations. On the other side of it, just a couple of quick things I'll note out about probation and my earlier point about where we've had a limited focus. And one is that we haven't really attacked the bigger structural changes in probation that would help us align with what we know about adolescent development. So things like long, lengthy court orders, not having enough family-centered practices, not using incentives and opportunities as a primary motivator for young people as opposed to the threat of sanctions. And connected to that is, as you talked about, Patrick, using confinement for technical violations of probation. Again, this is a process that is really just counterproductive when we know we get better results with young people in communities, but really doesn't serve the long-term interest. Put them in institutional care where harm can be done for behaviors that are largely symptomatic of adolescent behavior. But to my other point about this broader idea of youth development and how it differs from just thinking about delinquency prevention. I feel that that's one area, and I think the models that you're hear my colleagues talk about really focus on that, which is seeing the whole field of youth development and understanding that simply training probation officers largely on deficit-focused approaches, training them on addressing criminogenic needs and recidivism, fails to see the whole field, if you will, in terms of thinking about the other things that young people need. Being connected to mentors, being connected to positive people and organizations in their community, learning about civic engagement, helping them nurture and explore their own personal interests and what their career options may be. Those are the things I do with my own teenagers in my own house. And those are the things that most of us would agree are good for young people. I think that we have to really expand our view. And I think that's what you'll really hear from the other panelists in terms of different approaches and programs and initiatives that really try to see youth development on the whole. The last thing I'll just say is when we look at this youth development, it's also important to understand how important identity is to young people as well. So all of these things must be done within the context of where they live. That means having a very intentional and explicit focus on race equity, partnering with community-based organizations in the neighborhoods where they live, organizations that are trusted by the community, using people who've had similar experiences as the young people who come into the system. Quite frankly, probation can't do this alone. So if probation isn't making a concerted effort towards these community partnerships, then the young people, the families, the communities, they're not going to trust the interventions. And so then when we don't get the results that we're hoping for, it becomes quite.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that very much. We're going to come back to you, of course. I'm now going to turn to Kevin Williams, who is the manager of probation for Pierce County, Washington, which is Tacoma and surrounds. So Kevin, you've been pioneering many of these reforms in Pierce County. What are some of the changes you've made, and are you seeing similar changes when you talk to your colleagues around the country?
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you to the good people at Stoneleaf Foundation and my colleagues on the panel for the opportunity to join y'all. Before I start up, I just always want to express gratitude to our elders and past leaders who had the wisdom and courage to pursue reform in the early 2000s when it wasn't popular. Also, gratitude to our supervisors, our frontline staff, and our community partners that are in the trenches every day doing the hard work. We started our reform efforts in early 2000 in partnership with the Casey Foundation to pursue juvenile detention alternative initiatives. Since that time, like similar sites, we've decreased our usage of secure detention and out-of-home placement drastically. An example is in 2000, the average daily population was 163. In 2019, it was 17 young people. In terms of out-of-home placement, we committed 190 youth in 2000. In 2019, it was 36. Despite some of those decreases, we recognized that we had a long way to go and we still had so much work to do with a system that is inherently racist and oppresses folks of color. We also recognized that our reform efforts had plateaued, so we were excited to have an opportunity to partner again with the Casey Foundation in 2015 to pursue probation transformation work. Some things that really appealed to us at the time, knowing that we needed to reinvigorate our reform efforts, was the first thing we wanted to do was have a meaningful partnership with the research community to apply, operationalize the research from adolescent brain development to probation practice. Second thing that was really important to us was to establish a meaningful, genuine partnership with parents and caregivers, have them at the table to direct us and be with us as we move forward with our reform efforts. We recognize that our system inherently demonized parents as the problem, and we needed to shift that. Third thing we wanted to accomplish was establish more meaningful partnerships in the community and expand our interventions and our positive youth development menu. We typically provided evidence-based programming, but we felt like there was so much more to offer to young people. The other thing we wanted to do was increase our partnerships with grassroots organizations and those that had a lived experience in the system working with our young people. And the final thing that we really needed to do was to change our organizational culture. We recognize as leaders that we had a top-down approach. When we started this work in 2000, we were told when we were on the front line, like, get on the bus, the bus is moving. You either need to join it or get off. So we recognized in this day and age that type of leadership is just not going to apply. So we wanted to work on our organizational culture as well. And then the final thing was to eliminate the racial and ethnic disparities that exist in our system. Since that time, some of the achievements that we made with probation transformation is we started up a partnership with Dr. Sarah Walker from the University of Washington. We had about 6 to 8 frontline staff work directly with her and co-design a new probation model called opportunity-based probation. Again, operationalizes adolescent brain development research, which essentially we all know that young people are way more driven by incentives than punishment. So that's a part of our probation practice now. So far, we've done it in, I believe, 3 years, and definitely some promising results that are coming out of that. We established a family council that's 12 parents and caregivers and young adults that have a lived experience in our system. They meet monthly, they receive a stipend, and they are at the table with us kind of navigating and directing traffic as we move forward on our reform efforts. They give us insight into policy, new programs, and that's been a very meaningful partnership. We've grown our community partners from when we started this. We had 3, we're over 20 now. And we just have a very robust menu of positive youth development program options, similar to what Steve said, opportunities for young people that we would want for our own children. We have arts program, woodworking, outdoor activities, yoga, culinary, the list goes on. And these programs were set up after we did convenings with young people and families to ask them what we were missing from that menu. And that's how we started that. We've been in the last 2 years pursuing diversion enhancement very strongly, increasing our usage of diversion, and then also creating opportunities to have community-led diversion with community partners at the table. And then finally, a big focus has been, attending to the culture. So we started up a shared leadership team program, our shared leadership team. It has 8 frontline staff that are influencers working with formal managers and supervisors, and we meet twice a month to talk about our culture and how reform work is going. Our journey's been, when you pursue probation transformation, there's no book on the shelf you can pull off. So you're constantly navigating in the adaptive challenges waters, and you need to have everyone at the table, including your frontline folks, so they can have their voice. So that's been some of our big efforts that we've been leading in the last 5 years and working on. It's not perfect, it's been bumpy. But I think later we'll be able to talk about some of the results that we've achieved. Some of the things that I've heard nationwide that have been successful, Patrick, I know there's a lot of good stuff happening in LA with community-led diversion. I know a lot of good work's going on with credible messengers. And here locally, we have a partner named Sarome Fong, who's the director of Point One North Consulting. And they use a peacemaking circle to help communities, young people, and systems come together, have meaningful discussion, and look at transforming the system. So those are some of the things that I'm aware of. I'll turn it back to you.
A whole lot to there. We'll be coming back after everybody else has had a chance to weigh in. I'm going to turn to David Muhammad, who is currently the Executive Director of the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, but he was formerly the Chief Probation Officer for Alameda County, that is Oakland, and former Deputy Commissioner in New York City Department of Probation. So David, what were some of the reforms you put in place when you were leading the Alameda County Probation Department? And in your current role, looking across the country, where do you see probation services headed?
Thanks, Patrick, and good to be with folks today, my friends and colleagues on the panel. One thing, I think the construction crew waited until it was my turn to get going. So you might hear some of that in the background. So I was struggling with, detailing all of the things that we've done whether in Alameda County or when I was in New York with Anna and Vinny, or in DC with Vinny and others. And so I'd really like to say, both the work that we've done, as well as I think some that I've been able to work with other jurisdictions around the country in the past few years, I like to describe in kind of an RIR framework: reduce, improve, and reinvest. So reduce the size of the system and significantly improve the system of what is that reduced system, and then reinvest the savings or just investment period into communities. So some of those reduced steps have been not supervising youth at all who are assessed as low risk. And so we did that in Alameda, started that process in Alameda County, and there's a few other counties, really hoping to educate the court, but even when they're placed on probation, putting them in what might be called banked caseloads. And so not touching young people supervised as low risk, keeping the time of supervision to no more than 10 months. And so that the kind of government intrusion in the young people's life is not prolonged. Using incarceration as a last result, right? Only for young people who, we call high, young people who have high level severity offenses and who are assessed as high risk. Reduce over-reliance on out-of-home placements. And this is kind of the non-seen, forgotten part of the system that is pretty bad in terms of sending young people far away, thousands of miles away, right? I mean, even in progressive San Francisco, they send young people 3,000 miles away to Pennsylvania. That practice is stopping, but that has gone on for many, many years. And no incarceration for technical violations. Those are some of the steps in terms of reduce. Around improve, right? Change, I think the primary piece is change the duty of a probation officer from kind of supervision and those other pieces to your job is to connect young people with services, supports, and opportunities that build on their strengths and address their needs. And there's many POs who do that every day, but that's not in their job description. And they work alongside POs who don't do that, right? I think it was a JDI conference where we talked about how it's different from department to department. And somebody said it's different from cubicle to cubicle, right? And so we need to institutionalize this notion that my job is to connect you to the community services that you need. The last thing I'll say in terms of reinvestment is really focusing back into the communities, especially those with the highest rates of juvenile crime and incarceration. And yes, on community services, but also we just need investment in these communities in terms of infrastructure and education and employment and services and opportunities. We can talk a bit more about what we're seeing. I'll just give two quick examples and be done. One is I'm working in San Francisco to close their juvenile hall. So working with a team of folks where they're going to not have a detention center in that city and county. And in California, in the last legislative session, there was a bill before the state legislature to reduce probation terms to 6 months. And that bill had a lot of support. Then COVID hit and everybody had to reduce the number of bills that went before the legislature. And so it's very likely that will come up the next session. And it had a lot of support where it would reduce the time all young people are on probation to 6 months. And as I think folks mentioned LA already, there is developing, it's been developing for a while. It's not yet perfect. But a major diversion a strategy where basically all young people, except for those serious felonies, would be diverted to community-based diversion. So a lot of incredible progress around the country.
Wow, it's, again, a lot to come back to. But I'm going to turn right now to Vinny Schiraldi, who's currently the co-director of the Columbia Justice Lab and was the commissioner for the New York City Department of Probation. And before that, the director of Washington, D.C.'s Youth Rehabilitation Services Department. So Vinny, you were the probation commissioner during the ramp up for Close to Home when you and Gladys Carrion and lots of other folks worked to bring hundreds of New York City kids home from upstate youth prisons. How did the probation department need to adapt to new demands and new roles? What were some of the things that you put in place during that time? And again, what are some of the themes or patterns you're seeing when you look in other places around the country at this point?
Patrick, I'm wondering whether that's a better question for Anna. Maybe I should come after she gives that description. She was the deputy commissioner with me specifically on juvenile. So most of what I'd say, I'd be like chatting with her and saying, what the hell did we do about that? And then maybe come after her and can say a few provocative things about whether people should be on probation at all or not.
Sounds fine. Easy to be flexible with that. So I'm going to just introduce Ana Bermudez, who is the commissioner, current commissioner for the New York City Department of Probation, and as Vinny said, formerly the deputy commissioner for that department, and before that, the director of juvenile justice programs for the Children's Aid Society. So Ana, as you take up the question that Vinny just dodged about what it was like to implement close to home, I'd appreciate it if you'd also talk a little bit about how your department's been affected by the raise the age legislation and how, as close to home reforms have kind of matured and taken hold in New York City, how has probation continued to evolve?
You would think by now I know how to unmute myself. Well, if we had like a whole day, then we could answer that. But I will then try to keep it to the 5 minutes time frame. So there have been two major systemic reforms in New York City in the past 10 years. One is what Vinny was just talking about, the close to home, or it was really a dispositional reform process, right? How I like to describe it is, let's keep them at home, and then if we can't, keep them close to home, right? Because it was this two-step process here. Then in 2018 and then 2019, raise the age took place in New York City. So those are, you know, two systemic issues that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then internally, at the same time, we were really transforming what David has referred to as sort of the job of the probation officer. And that has been now infused with a restorative justice framework, the Youth Thrive framework, which our staff have absolutely taken, you know, embraced, and it's become like a verb, you know, among juvenile probation officers, and resiliency. And it's given people like a language over which they can communicate. And it's been the centerpiece of, you know, both case planning and case reviews. So that's been a great thing, and a continued, you know, emphasis on adjustment, right? And so I will cite a statistic because this is incredible to me. For fiscal year 16, we were at 28% of adjustment rate, which was actually higher than when I started, okay? But in fiscal year 20, even after raise the age, 39%. And that's overall. And so when you look at certain categories of low risk, low offenses, that's like 60, 70, you know, between 65 and 70%, you know, and so on and so forth. So that's been a huge shift, certainly for us. We also use evidence-based practices and restorative justice within, you know, the adjustment process. So let me talk a little bit about close to home and the dispositional process. We switched the way that we were making recommendations to court. You know, the courts in family court, as you know, they pay a lot of attention to the investigation reports and the recommendation from the department. And so it was very inconsistent. We went to a structured decision-making matrix that has really reduced, we've continued to like reduce the number of placements of youth in New York City. I can't remember the exact calendar year, but maybe a couple of years ago, there were 90 placements only. And not one of those kids who was placed scored as low risk behaviors in our assessment, you know, instrument. So that's been like an incredible process. We also now have violations of probation, half of which result in either, you know, in reinstatement of probation, either at a different level or across in our alternative to placement processes, because as part of that reform, we layered probation. Probation in New York City, juvenile probation has 4 levels. And so there's different pieces. We want to give the young people all the opportunities that are possible to be able to make it in the community, if you will. So then in Raise the Age, we were then very well positioned to, you know, absorb the number of young people who were being, you know, who were entering the system as 16 and 17-year-old misdemeanor with misdemeanor cases, and then removals from adult court. And that's been, quite successful as well. We've maintained an 87% success rate in adjustment. But I think part of the way that this has happened also is that we have been able to, with the juvenile team, really shift the approach of the probation officer to a coach, to somebody who's building resiliency, somebody who's concerned with the well-being of the young person. We've also, added parent coaches to our resources, so that parents who've had experience in the system are able to be, a sounding board, to parents of kids who are with us. And so, I think I saw a question or two about, how do you change the culture? It's all part of, it's not one thing, it's having the people in leadership who, are relentless in the language, in the approach, and then there's also, I think, things like having a framework that you can refer to, and really when you're doing then case reviews or case planning, how are you building resiliency there? How are you incorporating, adolescent, brain development? How are you applying evidence-based practices? Because, and so I think that all those things have really helped us, change our practice. VOPs also, technical VOPs are almost non-existent. When we file VOPs is really for public safety issues. And so that's where we're at overall. There's a lot of detail here that I'd be happy to answer questions about. And so I'll pass it to Vinny.
Thanks, Anna. So Vinny, you lay claim to being provoke.
So I was, I'm in the process of writing a book about probation and parole. So I'm getting to kind of go back to the origins of probation and parole and look at where we came from, look at what a lot of the case law says about why we exist, why we're able to do some of the things we're able to do, like revoke people for non-criminal behavior and incarcerate them for that. And in the process of that, one would think, well, if you're going to get incarcerated for not committing a crime, the standard should be much higher, of course. But obviously, it's the opposite way around. The standard for proof in a revocation hearing is a preponderance. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. You don't have an attorney to represent you necessarily. You're not entitled to one. So it's sort of, when you just kind of wipe the slate clean and take a de novo look at this stuff, it's pretty fascinating where it all came from and what the case law says about it. And much of it dates back to the progressive era when and to the sort of friendly visiting program in the middle of the 19th century or early 19th century, where middle and upper class women were visiting the poor, mostly Irish and Eastern European immigrants. And I just pulled one quote from Josephine Shaw Lowell, who was a sort of architect of the friendly visiting program, which later would develop into what probation was modeled after. A constant and continued intercourse must be kept up between those who have a high standard and those who have it not, and that the educated and happy and good are to give some of their time regularly and as a duty, year in and year out, to the ignorant, miserable, and vicious. And I obviously deliberately chose a provocative term, but if you look at the Gagnon and Morrissey decisions, which are the later decisions that define how many protections you get if you're being accused of a revocation, they hearken back to the friendly visiting program and really very much depend on a friendly approach to probation supervision and haven't really been touched since the war on drugs, the war on crime, mass supervision, mass probation have occurred. Now we have a situation where for overall, it's 1 out of 58 adults in America under some form of supervision. At its height, 1 out of 12 Black men. And I feel like our notions of what probation is and isn't just really need to be challenged at a much more elemental level. And I feel like, now in this moment when we're, when the Black Lives Matter movement is having such a profound impact on society, it's not a bad time for us to grapple whether people need to be on probation at all. And in even maybe more profound way than David and Anna have just talked about in terms of reductions, whether if we didn't exist, would you invent us? If you came into a jurisdiction, you said, look, we're gonna have some number of kids that need something by way of support, supervision, mentoring, and there was no probation department. Would you go out and hire, would you take your money, your tax dollars, and go out and hire the people who in most places are doing it to do it? Or would you pay churches in their community or pay nonprofit organizations, pay credible messengers to provide them with some level of services, supports, and opportunities, as David mentioned, without sort of inventing probation? And if you wouldn't invent probation, should we continue to exist? I just think at a very elemental level, we need to ask ourselves that question at this moment. Because if we're not going to ask it at this moment, when are we ever going to ask it? There are places that are closing their last training school. These training schools, these youth prisons, started right around the same time probation did. They're based very much on a parens patriae, state as parent model. I'm not sure the state makes a good parent. And it's hard to have this discussion when you have like field leaders like Stephen and Kevin and Anna and David on the call, because you kind of want to root for them as the kind of people you'd want organizing some sort of supervision and support mechanism. But I think we really need to ask ourselves, and I think in the juvenile system, we really can ask ourselves that question. I think if we're honest, our systems naturally gravitate towards keeping our populations, whether we should keep our populations or not, because that's kind of what we start to believe in our own selves and believe in the product we put out. And I think it's super hard for us to examine that product when we're in the seat of producing that product. So I'm not convinced yet that we should have no probation, but I tell you, if I had the opportunity to experiment with it and to really kind of sit with communities that most of these kids come from and say, here's my budget, and here's the budget that we spend on revocations. Let's cobble that budget together and imagine no revocations and only community cohesion and support for this group of young people that looks like this, that has this prior record, this risk, this everything. What would you do, community? And maybe those communities would invent probation. I'm betting a couple of them wouldn't. And I think it'd be interesting to test what they invented versus what John Augustus invented in 1846.
Well, great. So the good news is we only have another 25 hours to begin to unpack the last 5 panelists' comments. We're going to take about 25 minutes to delve a little bit deeper, and I'm going to suggest we focus on 3 themes. One is just to answer the basic question for those who have information. Anna shared some of hers. What are the data telling us? What are the performance measures telling us about these new forms of probation? Are we seeing changes in the number or percent of violations, the use of detention, new charges, successful completion, all that kind of data stuff? And in particular, what do the data tell us about racial disparities? Are we seeing any changes in the lack of equity and fairness in how probation and other parts of the youth justice system have been implemented? So that's like one area, like what are the numbers telling us? And we'll spend a little time with that. The second has to do with essentially implementation and advice you would give to others. In other words, every one of you have been through some version of reinventing probation. how did you get key stakeholders on board? How did you work with communities? What did you learn that you wish you had known before you started? What advice would you give to other jurisdictions? So that's like the second category, which I'll repeat in a moment. And then finally, I'd like us to take up Vinny's challenge. So what is the future of probation, and how far can we go in rethinking and reimagining completely what probation, or something that substitutes for probation or does away with probation, what that might look like? What are we seeing out there in the field that gives us some hints? So I'm going to throw it open, starting with the first set of questions, which basically has anybody who's got data, bring your data. What are you seeing in terms of results of the changes that you've seen made in terms of number of violations, the use of detention or incarceration, new charges, successful completion, and again, especially what are you seeing in racial disparities?
So if I can take the racial disparities issue first in a way, because what is difficult at probation to look at racial disparities is that we are, quote unquote, receiving the young people who are coming onto probation already are in a racially disparate, rate, right? So what we did was that we looked at, what we needed to look at was looking at that rate and doing a relative rate index analysis. That still, we need a lot more, but we found that Black youth come into probation at 15 times the rate of white youth, right? So if you look at our numbers, just numbers, you're always going to find young Black men overrepresented in everything we do. And so we needed to, the analysis we have to do to see what our decision-making was doing, whether, our job was then to not exacerbate and sort of maybe even reverse a little bit of, that issue. And we actually have found that we're doing pretty well, and that we are, young Black men, even they're getting adjustment rates only, like, not statistically significant, lower than white youth, but not statistically significant. That we are, our placement recommendations are lower, are less for young Black men and Hispanic young people coming through our doors. So we are performing well, not perfect, but well in terms of making sure that racial disparities are not exacerbated through our decision making. That's a big, in terms of our placement recommendations, that has a lot to do certainly with some of the culture change, but also our structured decision making matrix that I will be happy to share with anybody who wants it. In really making our practices more uniform across the boroughs and across judges, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the analysis is complicated because jurisdictions that don't have like researchers and whatever, that can be difficult. But if you partner maybe with a university, that would be, helpful to make sure that our practices are not making things worse than they already are.
Patrick, if I can, I'll jump in on the racial disparities question, and I want to expand it a little bit to also think about equity. So a few things in terms of the national data on disparities. As I mentioned before, if you go back to 2005, and I'm kind of making this connection between where we've seen a wide proliferation of evidence-informed practices, approaches, techniques for probation officers. And if you take that data from 2005 to our most recent data, even though you see dramatic reductions in the use of confinement nationally, you actually see that Black youth in particular are actually more likely to be confined than they were 15 years ago. And so that's not blaming those techniques, but what I would say is somewhat predictable if we have a narrow focus in terms of the way that we approach it. In my estimation, the single most significant distinguishing characteristic of our youth justice system in this country is its disparities. I think if an alien race came down and they didn't know anything about our history and social constructs and only knew math, the first logical question looking at juvenile justice system data would be, why are so many Black people locked up? Why are so many Black and brown kids locked up? It is the most distinctive characteristic of our system. And you can't fix a problem that is not named. And so I think that's been a challenge for a lot of jurisdictions, is actually being very explicit and intentional. And then to this equity piece, beyond reducing the disparities, again, it's predictable if you don't have an equitable solution process. So making sure that you have voices of young people, impacted families, community leaders that represent the young people who are coming to the system, looking at the ranks of probation departments and the juvenile courts. So what does staffing look like? Not only the line staff, but managers, supervisors, leaders. All of these are equity questions. And when we're not addressing those, then the results are somewhat predictable, because we all have blind spots and we're going to miss a lot of opportunities. We're going to miss what some of the barriers may be for people of color if we don't have the right people at the table to take that on. Then the last piece I'll just mention with diversion, and I mentioned before the disparities, that the latest national data show that 48% of delinquency cases for white youth are diverted versus 37% for Black youth. This country, white youth are actually more likely to be diverted for a person offense than a Black youth is for a public order offense. And so the challenge really is, how do we kind of get out of this system focused silo where system stakeholders and actors, and I think this kind of begs to Denny's provocative statements about, do we need probation? If we're so focused on system stakeholders having the solutions, then the results are somewhat predictable, because we're just going to be missing a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, I'll echo that, because in New York City, there's like a lot of news about like how much juvenile crime has gone down, and juvenile arrests and arrests also in the adult system or whatever. And then when you look at who's being arrested, it's still the same people. So that's where the equity issue comes in. That's why we look at the relative rate index, because we haven't seen it change in the 10 years that I've been at probation, even as arrests have plummeted, even as, so it's a much larger issue than us, obviously. So like as a society, we just have to take this on.
And just quickly, and I'll try to also talk about some of the other stuff, is, I think 2 points here. One, when I was in Alameda County, before I got there, was a lot of blame of, it's not us, it's who the police sends us, it's who the court sends us, right? And so to Anna's point of relative rate index, we looked at that, and, the county's the county was 13% Black, but 50% of the young people on probation were Black. We looked at that, but even though 50% of the people sent to us were Black, when we looked at who we were violating and incarcerating for violations, 75% of the youth that were in custody on violations were Black. And so we owned that 25%, right, increase, and really looking at what the practices are. And so 2 quick things. One, around Stephen's incredible point of how some great practices like diversion sometimes exacerbate the disparities. I've really been struggling with this issue for a lot of years because of often when you implement things like certain detention alternatives, and even reporting centers, and expediting cases, and really reducing the number of folks who come in the front door through reliable risk assessments or other pieces like that, it doesn't improve disparities. But I also have to say, if there were 1,000 youth locked up and 500 of them were Black, and now there are 200 youth locked up and 120 are Black, the disparity is greater, but I will take, right, 380 fewer Black youth locked up, right? And so that is what's happening. That doesn't mean we ignore the disparities, the growing disparities, but we also have to celebrate that the sheer number is pretty significantly down over the last few years.
And I'd also just add, sometimes what we see through these decreases in the population is that things that we said couldn't go away, they actually go away for white kids, right? So when you have youth prisons that have one white kid in it, guess what? We're not incarcerating a whole population. So, it's a demonstration point. But any other comments about data or about, obviously racial disparities and equity carries through all of our conversation, but anybody?
Just one very quick point,
yeah.
Patrick. Vinny and I worked with LA Probation for almost 3 years. Well, 2 years, Vinny and I stayed on for an extra year, and we developed a decision-making matrix for them that was not implemented, but it's something we can share that we thought, because it also addresses this racial disparities issue, right? And it was a look at offense severity and risk level, and really saying that incarceration should be a last result for the very high issues. And so we can go into that later, but I see a bunch of questions about that. And we sat with the judges in LA, with probation, with defense bar, with prosecutors. We did a round of meetings and discussions to develop that, which wasn't perfect, but it was collaborative, and it was much better decision-making process that we can share with folks.
That's kind of a natural segue into the second group of questions, which has to do with implementation and partnership and what advice you give to other folks, sort of building on this question of how did you build support for change? What did you learn through the process of implementation? And, you've got, I don't know, maybe 600 folks on this webinar. What advice would you give to folks out there who'd like to learn what you learned after you first started?
I could kick things off. And I just wanted to go back to the last one real quick in terms of data and just our journey. Again, probation transformation for us, 2014 to 2019. And what we've seen overall, there's been a percentage decrease across the system points during that time, from referrals to diversion to disposition of probation to out-of-home placement. I think the interesting thing for us, though, that we've seen in terms of racial and ethnic disparities, and Black children, because that's who's most overrepresented in our system, is that the out-of-home placement decrease in percentage is outpaced their white counterparts and all other children. We haven't seen something like that before, so it's encouraging to us. So out-of-home placements decreased for all children by 38%. For white children, it's 36%, but for Black children, it's 52%. And we've been very strategic with our policies and practices to say we're not sending young people out of our community anymore. We want to keep them here. The downside has been, though, is that Black children are getting more adjudications to probation and less opportunity to diversion. So that's the next kind of focus point, is to create opportunities for them to go to diversion. But that has been one significant thing. And then the other thing that we've seen is we track reoffense and return to system once you get done with probation. And do you return on a felony 1 or 2 years post? And what we've seen is when we started this, Black children, the percentage of return was around 38%. And then last time we tracked it in 2017, since probation transformation, it went down to 24%. And the overall average has decreased to 20% too. So we are seeing some indications that being strategic in this transformation is impacting in a positive way. In terms of community partnership, I'll keep it quick. We've done a lot of work in there, and I think the big thing we've learned is, one, acknowledging the marginalization that's happened with community partners, particularly grassroots organizations and neighborhoods that have been impacted by our system, and taking it slow, knowing that trust and relationship takes time, particularly on the history of marginalization, and then not being coming at it from a place where the system is trying to dictate, like, we want this program or we want this from you. It's how can we be good partners, and how can you help our young people and families? Like, what do you bring to the table, and how can we support you? So I think really trying to shift that frame on how we approach it has been some good learning moments from us. And that's based on acknowledging the history of the system marginalizing these communities.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Others on advice you would provide to your colleagues?
I mean, I don't know if this is advice or, there's so many little things. It's just a lot of little things that make up the big picture, really. Certainly what David just alluded to for our initial set of reforms, we met with all the stakeholders. We created a resource book or a bench book, however you want to call it, and gave it to each stakeholder group. We went to each of the counties and, trained everybody on the new system and how it was going to work and so on and so forth. And so that's definitely huge, of being transparent and also being able to get people on the table. And so long as it's very clear who the ultimate decision maker is, because we knew that ultimately this was a probation process, but we brought in a ton of people into the room to duke it out. Basically, our structured decision-making matrix, the one that has been implemented, was the 7th or 8th version, I think, of it. And as we all figured out where things fit. So that's one thing. But in terms of also of internal, one thing that I don't think is often talked about is that if we want to change the way our probation officers and the probation, ethos, if you will, needs to change vis-a-vis working with families and working with the young people, it has to be a parallel process within the organization itself. And we don't pay a lot of attention necessarily to supervisory relationships, to, how people get even disciplined within your department, how quality assurance, relationship building, all that kind of stuff is all a parallel process, and one cannot and will not happen without the other. So that's one thing that I think we've invested a lot of time and effort in, and created, I think, a learning community also, so that we can, be able to really sit down and learn from what we're doing and make adjustments as we need to.
Okay. Anyone else on this? So last set of questions basically have to do with the future of probation, or whatever might take its place. Vinny raised a lot of fundamental questions, starting with what I think is a great question. It's kind of, if you zero-based the whole thing, if you were walking in and probation didn't exist, and you sat down with a bunch of folks from communities that are heavily impacted by the system and said, we could spend X amount of dollars on something that looks like this, or we could do something very different. What would you want to see happen? Just curious what other folks have thought about what could either be a very different form of probation than currently exists, and with the incremental changes that we've talked about today, or what could be a totally different approach to responding to young people who get into trouble with the law.
I think, because I've been thinking about this somewhat also, but from a slightly different angle, which is that if we wanted to create the most antithetical system, to adolescent development and growth, et cetera, it's the adversarial, law-based truth, or, guilt or innocence dichotomy that we've created. To me, blow the whole thing up from that point of view. You do something that is arrestable, let's say, base it on a community-based restorative justice approach to try to resolve the issue. If that doesn't work, then maybe we can consider other, more judicial or whatever things. But basically, young people need to learn and need to, sort of reflect and take, accountability for what has happened in a way that promotes growth and resiliency and all that stuff, and healing, not, not blaming, punishing, this version of yourself that then is going to get you in a path that probably is less than helpful. So I would start there. But if we want to think about, probation, there's so many other things that one could do. Remember, Vinny, and when we went to the UK, and nobody under the age of 18 there can be put on probation. Basically, don't love the term, but you get assigned a youth offending team of, community-based people, ACS type people, DOE, the elephant in the room in this justice system that's never there, in terms of accountability also for the young people's education. And so it's just, it's a whole different wraparound the family, the kid, give them, obviously give them voice and meaningful intervention. But yeah, I mean, I think very few of us would create I hope, what we've put together.
The European example that you just gave, the Germany example, is a good one. And just to add to that, nobody under 18 can be tried as an adult in Germany. So everybody, whatever crime they commit under 18, they're in the juvenile system, and 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. Patrick,
maybe it was on my end. I thought it was just Anna, but I think maybe my end froze. So go ahead. Don't mind me.
18, 19, and 20-year-olds can be in the juvenile system, and 2/3 of them are. And 90% of homicide and rape cases, like the serious ones, are retained in the juvenile system. So there is an exponentially different approach that Western culture takes. I visited a program in New Zealand recently where they were sending their kids really far away to the detention facility. It was tribal up way in north in New Zealand, and they the tribe said, "This is crazy. We got to send our kids 3 hours away for no matter what they get picked up for a detention. And if that facility's full, it's 7 hours away." And so they basically said, "We got them. The tribe is going to take care of this. We don't want our kids to go to detention anymore. We will create what they called invisible remand." And so basically, if somebody needs to be remanded, the judge just remands them to the tribe, and they put them in somebody else's house, and a couple of tribal members will watch them, and they'll help teach them cultural activities. They just don't put their kids in correctional buildings. Vermont doesn't have a juvenile facility any longer, and they raised the age to 20. You don't have to go to New Zealand to see it. Several states now don't have any training schools left anymore. New York City, with 8 million people, if you go through juvenile court, you're not going to anything resembling a training school, youth prisons, 6 beds, 8 beds, 10 beds, the place David just toured today. So I think it's really worthwhile to kind of do the kind of analysis. I've always been impressed by the kinds of analyses Casey does when they come to a facility, to a jurisdiction where they really kind of what makes these kids tick down to a case level look. And Anna, we did a bunch of this when we did close to home. And when you really do that and you really capture the savings, you might come up with different answers than the ones we came up with. And I guess another element I would add in there is when you really ask parents and involve them, and you really ask young people who have been in the system and communities, I just think that opens things up to a whole different level of conversation. And we're all going to make mistakes. The community's not perfect. Departments are not perfect. I guess departments, we've had our 180-year run. I really kind of want to give the communities more of a shot than we're giving them right now. And I think when we talk about how we want to engage them and involve them, we have to ask ourselves whether we're full of shit when we say that, and whether we're just bringing in the nice community member who's going to nod their head and say what they want at our meetings, but then we're going to go do whatever we damn well felt like when we started. I really do want us to pick a fight with ourselves right now. We're only going to go through this for a limited period of time, and then we're going to move on as department heads. We damn well better feel good about what we look back on and see once we're done.
So I'm going to give David the last word here on this topic, and then we're going to throw open, Mark, to give you a heads up. You're going to send us some questions that have come in from the audience. So go ahead, David.
Yeah, no, thanks, Patrick. I just want to talk about what we've launched somewhat recently in Oakland as an attempt at this. So it's called the Neighborhood Opportunity and Accountability Board, the NOAB. And it goes back years. Vinny and I were in the city administrator's office in Washington, D.C. a million damn years ago. And we had this dot matrix map showing where all of our young people who were sent to us to be cured in isolation for a year, and we were spending a bunch of money on them, to only be sent back to their uninvested in neighborhood. And there were these clusters, as you know, right, of dots in neighborhoods that don't have any kind of investment or resources And so this idea of how could we better spend the $5 million a year on this 10-block radius than we're spending as the juvenile justice system. And so, so thinking about that, fast forward many, many, many years of thinking about that, we launched the Neighborhood Opportunity and Accountability Board in Oakland. So it is at the point of arrest diversion. So when police are arresting folks for felonies, youth for felonies, they immediately get a referral to this neighborhood community-based diversion program. So in the neighborhoods, we have the local pastors, business owners, community leaders, formerly incarcerated individuals, and victims of crime sit on a panel, and the young people come before them with incarceration not being an option, around discussing what they need and discussing what the family supports are needed. We launched this after years of planning, right, of course, with COVID. So the community gatherings are via Zoom. It's actually worked out better than I expected. But 30 young people so far, 28 of whom all charged with felonies, some of them pretty serious felonies, zero involvement in the system, immediate diversion right to the Neighborhood Opportunity Accountability Board. They come before this, what is designed to be council of elders, tribal council, whatever it might be, kind of taking the administration of justice back to the origins before we had these options. And they're assigned a life coach, a credible messenger, somebody who has similar lived experiences as them, to guide them through and connect them to other services. We have a group of community-based organizations. And so the pilot is funded by philanthropy, but the idea that the government should pick up the tab, hence the huge amount of savings we're providing for the government. And so far, so good. We've been up and running for about 5 months, not a single rearrest. And all of the young people, 100% participation, with except the one who moved the day after the arrest to another state, but 100% participation and no rearrest. Again, in a short period of time, but we think it will hopefully become one of the models that can be used as an alternative way to administer justice.
David, thank you. Mark, I'm going to ask you to frame some of the questions. We've had a whole lot of questions come in. We'll only get to a few of them, but if you could lift some up for us, please.
Of course, yeah. Thank you, everyone, for submitting your questions. Like Patrick said, we have several. We'll try to get to as many as possible.
Mark, we can hardly hear you. You might want to lift up your microphone a little bit.
My apologies. I was just saying there's several excellent questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible. So we'll dive right in. First question comes from Kay Shakira Washington, who said, is there any data or discussion about how youth and parents feel about the changes? I assume that means recent changes to probation.
Yeah, we have implemented a survey for young people and families at the beginning of their experience and then at the end. You know, there's obviously been challenges with collection of that, so I think it's right around 30% return rate. But I would think the biggest thing that kind of guides our work from young people, parents, young adults is our family council. They've been established since 2015. And that has been, I think, our biggest thing that we've used in terms of feedback on how things are going, and it's consistent. When we're trying to do anything new with a new program or policy, we will have family council members at the table giving us direction on that. So that's one of the biggest things that we've impacted. And it hits on what Vinny was talking about, though. Like, is it just one of those things that is a checklist and you say we have it and it's cool? Or is it something that you're really willing to sit at the table and hear, you know, that your system stinks, that it hasn't been doing well, and are you willing to make changes based on that? And, you know, it's been a tough journey to hear some of that feedback, but we believe it's a value of ours. So I think that's been the biggest thing that's helped us really shift from the lens of where parents and young people are coming from.
Great, thank you. Apologize for the pronunciation on the name. The next question comes from Najat El Said. Are there national organizations that help connect youth locally to community resources, like helping with vocational trades or community colleges?
I'll jump in. I don't have a specific answer for that in terms of national organizations. I would just pivot and say, I think what what's been most instructive for me in doing this work nationally with Casey is that there are values you need to hold, there's principles and there's models, but it all has to be locally firm. I think the success you hear, be it in New York, what David's experienced in DC and in Alameda County, and Kevin certainly in Pierce County, I think what's really driven that success is that it's locally developed and it has the input of everyone. And so I'll just, kind of point out with opportunity-based probation that Kevin talked about, and we get a lot of inquiries about that at Casey Foundation, a lot of folks who want to replicate it. And what I also always caution folks on is the reason why opportunity-based probation works and works so well is because everyone was involved, because they surveyed young people to find out what worked for them. They talked to families. They brought in the research community, had line staff involved in the design process. And so with all of these things, whether it's designing a new program that sits within probation, whether it's developing the resources and the services to get young people connected to vocational and career training, all of those things, got to put on your sneakers, got to put on your tennis shoes and get out there and find out, because what I find in most jurisdictions is the system stakeholders are often surprised at the number of resources, the number of grassroots organizations that are ready, willing, need the support, they need funding. They're not going to be able to operate on their own, so they need dedicated public investment. But those resources are there, and I think they will serve communities best when they're locally nurtured.
Great, wonderful, thank you. Next question comes from Samuel. As it relates to a trauma-informed juvenile agency, what advice would you give on getting the court to buy into a trauma-informed approach as well?
Can I just bring
go ahead, David.
And I was just going to make basic points. You can probably bring it home a lot better. Is just the notion that we have to include the courts on these reform efforts and this awareness lifting and education. So often, and I'll put myself at the top of those who have made this mistake, we don't include the judges, we don't include the courts. I just recently had a very interesting experience in San Francisco where the community advocates and even the system is at one place and the courts are very clearly in another place, right? And so just a real need to, engage judges, work with, and it's interesting because individual judges are with us, but kind of the court is not. And so in this example, right, not everywhere, but so just acknowledging a real issue, the need to work with the courts, work with the judges, include them in trainings and presentations and awareness lifting.
Okay. Next question comes from Ellen Sappers, a public defender at the Public Defender Association of Philadelphia. A lack of transparency and resistance to any change are huge problems in Philadelphia. Recent number of homicides among youth have further stimulated probation to lock up youth for safety instead of looking for community input and options. We've looked at close to home, but there is still no real momentum to actively decarcerate with hubs and diversion. The question is, how do we get the Oakland model accepted and implemented?
So I don't know which Oakland model they're referring to. I've been doing a lot of, not work would be a lot of presentations in Philadelphia, not a lot of work in terms of the gun violence reduction strategy. So that might be, and what I just say briefly is there's a lot, the increase in gun violence in the last few months over the country has risen. There's no question, it's a concern, it's an issue. It is almost the vast majority are adults. And yes, there has been an increase of young people, but if you still look at the total number of incidents of gun violence, the vast majority are amongst adults. And so you don't need to use the few individual pretty concerning incidents, don't get me wrong, to stop an entire reform effort, right? And so you just have what we should have, which is something more or different or special for those extreme cases. Right. And so, but that shouldn't affect the change of an entire system. And so, yes, so in Oakland, a homicide case wouldn't be eligible for this level of diversion, although many felonies would be, but the small percentage of young people who are arrested for a homicide is extraordinarily low, as it is most places, although those get a lot of media attention and a lot of concern, as they probably well should, but we should just understand the actual number versus how much of the space it takes in the public discourse.
So let me take that a little on a slightly different tack, which may be part of what you're asking in terms of, it seems that coordinating, part of what you're asking is that the coordination effort among, all the stakeholders or agencies involved in these issues. And sometimes it takes one person or two from, either within one agency or more than one agency to say, hey, I think this is a problem and we need to get at least starting to figure out where everybody stands and how we might, want to tackle this. Because sometimes even when you don't get, let's say you have a destination in mind, even when you don't get that destination, the process can be as important and generate change, sometimes not as much, but it can get you somewhere that then you can build on, increasingly over time to get more and more people on the same page and on board. But you generally will need somebody to take the lead and just push through that process so that it doesn't continue to be disjointed.
I just can't help but say Philadelphia really needs to pick up its game on this. It's tragic how bad probation and youth justice are being meted out in Philadelphia. There's an immense number of intelligent and decent people there. There's foundations. There's people from other jurisdictions willing to help. There's so many, and you have a open-minded, at worst, open-minded district attorney, at best, truly inspirational district attorney. So, lots of places you can't move because the DA is going to shame everybody if one bad thing happens. You don't have that in Philadelphia. You're running out of excuses, Philadelphia. For anybody listening right now, probably this is going to not get me invited to give a lot more speeches like David just said. I've been giving a lot of Philadelphia speeches too. But damn it, shame on you guys for your juvenile justice system right now. You need to pick up your game.
All right. Next question comes from Roy Adams from Ramsey County, Minnesota. My apologies if we've already asked this. Has any work with victims been included in any of the probation transformation work?
We're getting there slowly in terms of we're, trying to get infusing more of the restorative justice approaches in diversion and in, and more victim-focused work. It's not something that we've done in part, because we've had so many other things to take care of. But we do have every young person who goes through the adjustment process goes through a restorative interview where a lot of emphasis is placed on reflections on how the behavior or how this situation has impacted the victim and among other things. But there's a lot of work to be done in that regard for sure, with us in New York City at least.
And the quick, in the NOAB and Oakland Neighborhood Opportunity Accountability Board has a whole restorative justice process. Not only is a victim of crime on the actual panel, but when you have the agreement of victims, there's a whole restorative justice component, that there's a restorative justice process that becomes the alternative.
When they initiated the use of restorative justice panels in New Zealand back in the 80s, and basically said before you could even go to the sort of European, as Anna described it, adversarial process, if the victim and the offender, if the survivor and the involved party, depending on the words, were willing to go through reconciliation process, that was it. There was the prosecutor couldn't trump that. And if they came up with a disposition, that was the disposition. The number of people who penetrated further vanished. The notion that the system now pays attention to victims is just a lie. And when you give victims the opportunity, many times they want to engage in some other kind of process other than the silly, pointless, although, you know, sort of adjudicatory. So it does do that, but that's pretty much it. And most victims, that's not their main concern. They actually want to have their day in court. They want to have their say. They want to make sure that what's happening is reasonable. When they did it in New Zealand, overwhelmingly victims said yes. And Common Justice does this in Brooklyn. I'm on their board. Over 90%. And this is cases of adults, young adults, who have committed violent crimes up to the point where they're facing a year in jail or more. That's what the prosecutor would otherwise ask for. And over 90% of those times, victims say yes. The system now is so bad towards victims, let's leave the kids aside that have committed the act, but the victims get so little out of it now that there's almost nothing that wouldn't be better than that current process.
Okay. Thank you. Next question comes from Liza R., who said that she has worked with juvenile public defenders in Philadelphia and prosecutors in New York City. Does the research offer tips and guidelines for stakeholders when determining what length of probation may be the most appropriate and effective for each youth at disposition? I know that there are many factors to consider, but any evidence around what tends to work best would be great to review.
I'll weigh in on this one. It's actually right now, Casey, we're funding a project and we have a partnership with Urban Institute to develop some best practice guidance on justice issues. So like a lot of things, unfortunately, within the realm of juvenile probation, it's largely gotten a pass. When we think about justice reform, particularly youth justice reform, we're usually focused on facilities, rightfully so, but probation's gotten a pass. And so the research oftentimes has a lot of gaps. So there's not specific research on this length of stay on probation, but it's one of those things, even in our report 2 years ago when we developed recommendations, it's not a simple kind of 1 + 1 = 2. You have to kind of go a couple extra steps in the equation. And so if you look at the research, at least what we do know about young people in custody, we know that once you get past 6 to 9 months, you see kind of diminishing returns, meaning that they tend to do worse in those facilities. Any benefit that they would have received in terms of curriculum, services, treatment, that tends to diminish after a certain period of time. So by logical extension, it just doesn't seem to make sense, particularly in light of everything we know about adolescent development and youth development, to have young people on probation for any period longer than a year. Because in their mind and the way they process, that feels more like 2 years, and everything that comes out of an adult's mouth becomes white noise. So you really have to be, which really makes it even more important that we divert young people away from the system who don't need it, and for those who would have some benefit from supervision, that upfront we're laser focused on not just reducing delinquency, but we're laser focused on helping build up and strengthen the types of supports, the support network that's going to last and put them on the right trajectory long past the life of probation, which shouldn't be more than 6 to 9 months. So that's actual research that we're working to develop. But from everything else we know, again, about adolescent development, youth development, what we know about placement facilities, goes beyond logic to think that there's any benefit in having young people on probation reaching a lot of places 2 to 3 years.
Sorry, Patrick, I think we have you muted.
Patrick, you're muted.
There we go. I was just saying that we're at the end of our time, and there are many other questions. I wanted to first thank the audience for so many thought-provoking questions. Mark, I hope there's a way to capture the questions so that when we do post the recording of the webinar, if there's some opportunity for some of our panelists to weigh in with some comments to the questions we couldn't get to, that might be helpful to folks. This has been, for me at least, an incredible opportunity. Many years ago, over 30, when I was running juvenile corrections in a state, The one thing I hungered for was trying to figure out what other folks like me were doing in other places. You know, I could only read so much about the theory and practice of youth corrections, but having the real deal from folks who have been inside the belly of the beast and wading through the muck, if you will, to try to find their way to a new future was incredibly important to me. I hope it's been helpful to all the folks in the audience as we've done today. So virtual applause for the panelists. Thank you so much. You guys, as I said in an email, it's like Marvel Comics or something, the superheroes of probation reform all coming together. It's just been amazing. And again, thank you to the audience. Thank you to the Stoneleigh Foundation and to the Justice Lab for sponsoring this webinar. And I hope everybody stays safe, sane, and healthy. Take care.
Patrick, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
People were asking for structured decision-making. There were some questions on is there a way to get people the structured decision-making? David sent it to me. I just sent it to Mark, but I don't know if it's going to get to people in time. I wonder if Mark, you could say a word or two about whether we can follow up with some materials.
Yeah, so I can just clarify just a little bit for folks. So we are recording this webinar. If everything comes out okay, we will post this to the Stoneleigh Foundation YouTube page. We don't usually do this, but we can unlock comments for that video. So please, if there is a question or a comment that you would like to include, we didn't have a chance to get to it, you can post it there. Stoneleigh will also be sending around a post-event email. We will try to include as many of the resources mentioned as possible, but please follow up with us as always if there's something you'd like to see in particular.
That's terrific. Thanks again, everybody. Take care.